Good evening, NABJ family. Happy New Year. And welcome to 2019 webinars. Our first webinar of the year is with Ron Nixon. Ron is a former, and when I say former, I mean literally just a couple of days ago, a couple of hours ago. He was with the New York Times, a Homeland Security correspondent. And today is his first day on the job as the International Investigative Editor for the Associated Press. Ron, thank you so much for doing this webinar for us.
Sure, thank you. Pleasure to do it.
So before we get started, and here's the way it's going to work, guys. I think we'll spend about 25 minutes, 30 minutes listening to Ron. Ron obviously has a wealth of information, and he will share a lot of tools, a lot of tips on how to be the best investigative journalist, how to incorporate investigative journalism into your everyday reporting. And then we'll spend like the last 25 minutes or so taking your questions. Some of you have already written in your questions. You've emailed your questions to us, so we'll answer your question, have Ron answer your questions. Before we get started, though, on that, Ron, talk a little bit about your background. How did you become the acclaimed investigative reporter that you are today?
Okay, I don't know about acclaimed, but okay. So I actually started out as a music major in college, but I started out at a small Black newspaper in South Carolina, a Black weekly in South Carolina, and moved from there to magazines, including Vibe magazine, Young Sisters and Brothers YSB at BET. I worked for newspapers in Virginia and Minnesota. And from Minnesota, the Star Tribune, I went to the New York Times, and from the New York Times, which I was there for 14 years, and just recently left the New York Times after nearly 14 years last month. So, as you mentioned, very first day on the job. As you can see, my office behind me, there's a map, and that's it. Pretty blank, and so I'll get something in here soon. But in my current position, I oversee a team of 5 reporters who are around the world in Egypt, India, China, the UK, and I have one person here. Plus, I deal with any international investigations from any of the people throughout AP.
Okay, so the kind of reporting you will be doing, how will that differ from the New York Times?
Oh, in some ways it will be different. Obviously, I have a different role because I'm an editor rather than being a reporter, but essentially the reporting will be the same. It will be in-depth investigations about various topics around the world. I mean, just like my last piece from the New York Times was about how guns were being smuggled into Mozambique and used to kill the endangered rhinos.
All right, so here's what we're gonna do. I want you to really get to the meat of why we're here. Everybody is so excited to have this opportunity to hear from you. We asked the members, what did they want to see first? What did they miss most? As you well know, Ron, for those of you, all of you know, Ron was at the convention in Detroit. The room was packed, and I missed some of it. Many of others missed some of it. So we want to hear just the session, just so you get started.
Sure. So let's start first with what is investigative reporting? And I think there's a misconception about exactly what is investigative reporting. There's a lot of really long articles. There are narratives, which are really nice and good reads. There's also enterprise stories, which have an investigative element, but a good investigative story tells you that something is wrong. It tells you why that thing is wrong. It tells you who are the actors in that story that are responsible for that wrong. And it basically shines a light on a problem that affects society. And so the best way to talk about investigative reporting is just like, how do you come up with ideas to do this? Because I always hear people say that's the biggest thing for them. The ideas are all around you. I typically keep a little booklet or now I actually keep in the little notes section on my phone. One of the things that I do is I write down the things that I see. Just basic observation. Give you a quick example. I get off the train every day in Union Station in Washington, D.C. Several years ago, I saw these guys walking around Union Station looking like SEAL Team 6. And I had no idea who they were. It had Homeland Security investigations on their back. I mean, Homeland Security police on their backs. And I was like, who is that? So, I observed this for a few days. Eventually, I discovered that they were part of TSA, something called a Viper team, the Visible Intermodal something team, right? But that became a huge story because you typically think of TSA as being at the airport. And here these guys were out at this other transportation hub, but that it was something that a lot of people, including journalists, have passed by every day, but never noticed. So direct observation is one of the ways that I get tips or stories. The other things are reports. I read a lot of reports. I read congressional reports. I read audits. I read reports that comes from NGOs. And, you don't take everything with like these reports are the absolute truth. They get at the truth as close as they can, but it gives me ideas. It lets me know what like an auditor for the USAID or State Department is looking at, or an auditor for your local city that may have audited cell phone use by city employees. So I read a lot of reports just to sort of get an idea for what's happening. And I've got tons of stories because a lot of times things are just hidden in plain view. They're right there in the report.
Ron, let me interrupt you because
Sure.
my question when I hear you say you read reports, how do you get these reports? Do you FOIA them? Do you just, are you on a list where they send them to you? Great way to get stories, but how do you get these reports?
Most of the reports are actually just online. I mean, no matter what level of government or where you work, the reports are actually online. And most of them you don't really need to get a FOIA for. And those that aren't online, you can just go to your local level of government, be it the Board of Education or the Planning Board, or, and just get those reports. You don't really have to file a FOIA for them. Because they just make them available. The thing is that most of us don't read them. That's the problem, that most of us don't read what's actually in those reports, because a lot of the things that you end up seeing later in investigations, somebody talked about that at some level years before. And it's in some report about misspending of money or something. So reports are very valuable to read and to go through them and not just read the summary. That's if you take nothing else away from what I say, don't just read the executive summary. Actually read through the report. The other thing is other media. Believe it or not, I have gotten one of the biggest stories that I ever did about a surveillance program at the Postal Service, believe it or not, was because I read an article in the Buffalo News, and the reporter had the story. I mean, he only just mentioned it though. And so when I saw a reference to this guy's mail being monitored, the first thing that popped into my mind was like, what is this? So there are tons of tips for investigations in other media, because the reporter never made the link between the one item that he or she may have written about and the bigger story. And obviously we can talk about that more in the Q&A section. For those of you who work in city government or state government or federal government, the one thing I would say is when you start on your beat, because a lot of investigations, a lot of the best investigations are done off of the beats. When you go into that office, get every single blank form that you can, because that blank form tells you every bit of information that that government agency is collecting. So whether it's the DMV, whether it's the Board of Education, whether it's the plan, those forms are critical to informing your reporting, because it tells you exactly the kinds of information that they're asking. So when I go and file a public records request, we'll talk about that a little bit later, I will attach a form to my request saying that, hey, this is the information that I wanted that came from this form that you guys collect. Reading, I'm surprised at how often that we as reporters, and I say we, not just signal people out, but myself included, we don't read enough. So one of the things that I started doing early in my career was reading things like books, journal articles, things like that. But I also read like master's thesis, dissertations. I did a story for the New York Times about the global expansion of the Department of Homeland Security. The department is in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, operates in 70 different countries. That story idea came from reading a master's thesis that was done by a Border Patrol agent about how Customs and Border Protection, which is part of Department of Homeland Security, how they had expanded abroad after 9/11 because they wanted to be able to push the borders out. But again, that story, which I ended up reporting from Kenya, from South Africa, and from Costa Rica, it all started with me reading a master's thesis.
Okay, I got to ask that question then.
Sure.
Where do you find these master's theses? I mean,
so the master's thesis that I was getting was from the National Defense University, because that's where a lot of law enforcement people go to get their masters in whatever. So I just started scanning and looking at, particularly people who were at agencies that I covered to get their master's thesis and read the type of things that they were reporting on.
So you're going to the institution
Yeah,
that
the National Defense University, and then I just go through and look at the master's theses that were submitted and approved, and then I just look at the topics. And this one,
this is online.
yes.
Okay.
So this one just jumped out at me, that the global expansion of Department of Homeland Security. I saw another one about the Border Patrol and how they started to create their own intelligence agents at the agency. So, again, a lot of these things are just right there in a master's thesis. Now, a lot of times I just laid out information that can be gotten freely, but a lot of times you can't get that freely. And so this is where you got to utilize the open records laws of your state or country, because I know that there are people on here internationally too. So I'm a huge user of the Freedom of Information Act, the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. I have used PIA, the Public Access to Information in South Africa. I've used the UK open records laws, and they pretty much all work the same. You're basically sending in a letter, and a lot of times they'll just let you do it via email or a fax machine for people who still use fax machines to ask for a specific bit of information. But the thing is that you want to have done some reporting before you actually file a Freedom of Information request. One, to make sure that it's not actually already out there online. I made that mistake once, filing a Freedom of Information request for something that was online, embarrassing. But so you want to do a bit of reporting. One of the things I mentioned before was looking at the forms that the agencies that you cover collect, using that to inform your letter. And your request, the types of things that you're requesting, you want to be specific as possible, because if you're broad, a lot of times what they'll do is just say you're being overly broad, and they'll try to say narrow it, and you'll just end up wasting your time. So do a little reporting. I'm sorry?
What's the difference between a freedom of information and request and the open records request?
So some states have freedom of information laws. Other states call them open records laws.
But it's the same thing?
It's the same thing. Like the state of Minnesota, it's called the Minnesota Data Practices Act, but it's basically the open records law of the state of Minnesota. So, now the thing that you don't want to do is file a FOIA under the Federal Freedom of Information Act in your state. They will laugh at you and then they will turn you down. So, you make sure there's a great site, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, rcfp.org, where they actually have, if you go to the site, they actually have something that will let you generate a freedom of information or open records request. And you can do it by federal level or by state and by agency. It's a great resource. I would suggest people utilize it. Again, it's called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. It's rcfp.org.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to, many of the reporters, I'm sure, that are on the webinar with us today may not have as much time. I mean, you file a FOIA, and they have 5 days, 10 days, and then they ask for an extension. So what are some things that you can do to get probably a response faster? What are some things that you can do to kind of turn an investigative piece a little in a shorter amount of time?
Right. So the thing that you have to realize about open records laws, it all depends on the state. So some states, like the state of Minnesota, my home state, will say that they have to provide that information to you in a reasonable amount of time. Now, what's reasonable to them, what's reasonable to me are two different things, I'm sure. Some states actually have a very specific time frame, saying they have to provide you with that information in 5 days or less, and sometimes it's 14 days. On the federal level, they have 20 days to respond to you, not to give you the information, but to respond and say, hey, yeah, we got your FOIA. Now, granted, this can take a long time. So what I tend to do is I think about long-term stories that I can turn around once that information does come out. But I also think of what's in, I was going to get into this a little bit later, but when I conceive of a story, I always think about what is the minimal story that I can do. Ideally, I'd like to do this really big story. But if I can't do that because it's dependent on a FOIA, based on all the other reporting tips that I've talked about, can I get that story, a minimal story that's good? It's not as great as the one that I would like to do with all the stuff that I get from FOIA, but it's still a great story. So you have to build that in when you use FOIA. Now, again, some states, you can go get that information quickly. And one of the things that I would say for people who are in states like Virginia, because I work there, you can go and view the documents. So, and it costs you nothing to actually view the documents. You go view the documents, you take notes, you take the things that you need to do, or with your camera, snap a photo of the documents. And that's one way of getting around the time frame that it takes for you to come back with a FOIA. So just look at your state laws. If you go to, again, rcfp.org, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, they also have a listing of all the state laws that will tell you what the parameters are for them providing that information to you. And if you live in a state where they allow you to go and view the documents before you actually get them, I would utilize that. But make sure
Okay, great. I know I said we would wait, give you a half an hour to talk first, but our members they've got a lot of questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to move it up a little bit and we're going to go
Okay.
to questions now
Okay.
so we can get as many in as possible. The first question is, and thank you guys for sending your questions in. I can read them, so please keep sending them in. Where can you get ideas for daily stories in quick hits?
Right. Off of your beat. I mean, the thing is that, like I said before, the best stories, the best investigative stories come off of your beat, right? If you are looking at the audits that come off of your beat, right? Budgets are a great way to look to generate stories off of your beat. Give you a quick example. When I worked for the Roanoke Times, I went down in place of another reporter to cover a budget hearing in Henry County, Virginia. The thing that jumped out at me in the budget hearing was two figures. That the legal fees for that little county had jumped 200% from one year to the next. That started me on an investigation that ended up with the Henry County Public Service Authority guy being arrested because he was embezzling money and had 3 mistresses and a bunch of other things. But it all started with me just noticing that number in a budget. So it's like really knowing your beat, really having a command of your beat that allows you to do these things. If you cover the school board, where are the books? Where did the textbook come from? Who writes those textbooks? Whose job is it to buy the textbook? Why those textbooks? Why not other textbooks? Who does the food service? You know, all of those things are right there, right in front of you every day. So again, it's having a command of your beat and knowing the things that are on your beat, talking to people on your beat. And I was going to talk about sourcing, but when I say talking to people on your beat, I don't mean like the people at the very top. You source from the bottom up. You source the security guards when you walk into a building. Those are the people that, because they know who walk in there every day. You talk to the administrative assistants. They know where all the bodies are buried. A lot of the mistakes that we make is that we think that we need to talk to the person at the very top. Those people, for the most times, are political appointees. They know nothing. It's the people at the bottom that you want. You source from the bottom up, because remember, the biggest, most famous investigation in U.S. history is Watergate, and it all started with a security guard.
All right. What would you consider your most important online tool for your work?
For me, it's Tor browser, because Tor browser allows me to surf the web without fear of being tracked. And
Spell that. Is that tour like T-O-U-R?
No, Tor, T-O-R.
T-O-R. Okay.
It's an open source browser it looks like Google Chrome or Firefox, but it allows you to surf the web without actually, worrying about being tracked by cookies or even government monitoring. So a lot of the work that I do is sensitive, so I don't want someone trying to track me on the web. So that I don't mean Tor, I mean T-O-R. So questions just pop up, but yeah, just Google T-O-R and you'll see the browser that I'm talking about. It's actually an acronym for the Onion Router. The Onion Router, but T-O-R.
Okay.
It's how people get onto the dark web.
Okay. All right, here's another one. Many online tools databases require a subscription fee. Right. Since many small newsrooms have limited access to these tools and many journalists are on limited incomes, is there a must-have for those just getting into investigative journalism?
Right. So let me answer that in another way, a way around those subscription and fees, right? When I was working, as I said, I started out at a small Black newspaper in South Carolina. I didn't have like LexisNexis or Pacer or anything like that. As a matter of fact, we didn't even have the web then. That's a whole different story. But when the web was available and I was working at a magazine in North Carolina, the way I got around all those fees, I went to the library. Your library card gives you access to a lot of online tools that we never take advantage of. So I could
Like
go,
what?
well, like access to articles that you're using for background research, abstracts of journals articles, and sometimes the actual journal articles themselves. I mean, it's why I still keep my library card. For young people, a library is a building that has a bunch of books in it, just in case you guys, I know you guys think Google has like everything, but so that's a way of getting around that. I would say the most indispensable thing for me as an online tool is Pacer. It's the website that allows you to go and get federal court documents from around the country. It's a subscription based, but they only charge you like 5 cents or something per page. It can add up though. But again, the way I would get around that is your public library and universities and community colleges. I have found that those places have access to a lot of this stuff, and it's free. I've gone over to George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., or some of the other universities, and utilize some of those tools, even though I have access to them.
Okay, here's another one. How do you find information about what agencies collect to know what information they should have?
All right. I can tell you the first part of that, what information they collect. So if you go onto an agency's website, right, and you look at what their mission is, and you'll see a place where they will have like reports and things like that. But the first thing you want to know is like, what is the mission of this agency? What do they actually do? What are they mandated to do by law? And the way to figure that out is the state code will lay out the authorization for a particular government agency. So when I was in Minnesota, I would go into the state code to look at where was this agency set up, why is it set up, and what are its authorities. Then you go and collect that information that I mentioned before, the forms, because that will tell you like all the information that they collect. You can also, I didn't get into this as sources, but talk to people who used to be there. So I get like a lot of the old directories. I don't want the new directories. I want the old directories because I want to see people who've left. And then I follow them by going to like LinkedIn. And then I see where they are now, and I'll go on and either try to track down their email and send them a message through LinkedIn or something. And that has been really fruitful by utilizing the old directories, finding former people at that agency, because they can tell you where the bodies are buried.
So in the kinds of questions, is this cold calling? Because I love that idea of getting the old directories. So
Yes.
do you have an idea of what your story is prior to that? So you're emailing them saying, hey, I'm doing a story on XYZ. Can you help me out?
So some of this, one of the things I like to say about sourcing is like insurance. You need to have sources before you need them, right? Because you don't get into an accident and then try to get Geico, right? So sources are the same way. When I'm calling these people, I'm setting stuff up well before I even have a story idea in mind. What I'm doing is building my beat, right? Because again, the best investigations are built off of the beat. It's not some person like me sitting in an office working for 6 months or a year on a story. The best investigations are done by beat reporters. But when I'm calling these people, it's not always for a story. I'm calling them because I want to understand how things work. And so I start off with that conversation. Hey, I understand you used to work at such and such. Know you're busy, but do you have a few minutes where you could explain to me how this section worked? Like, how do you guys do permits at the Department of Environmental Quality? Like, how does that work? What's the first step? and just have that person explain to you, because they're comfortable, because you're not calling them up because you got a story now. But as you build that relationship, when you do call them up for the story, they're ready for it. And so that's what I mean by, getting those old directories, calling people. It's how Seymour Hersh, the famous New York Times reporter, he would write stuff about like secret agencies and things like that. Like he wrote some stuff about the NSA, and the way he found people to talk to at the NSA, he got a list of their credit union members. That's it. That's how he found sources at one of the most secretive institutions on the planet.
And you find these directories by just going through the agency and
yeah, you either go and ask for the old directories, or you just FOIA the old directories, and a lot of them actually have those directories online.
Okay.
Particularly city directories, they keep those things for like years. I've gone back and found people in the 1970s with bell bottoms and afros, in the directories, and so you definitely want to have those things. So when you want to like do these stories, these people will always also give you ideas, because they know the agencies, you don't. They may tell you stuff that's even better than what you're thinking.
All right, here's another one. So how do you organize and keep track of information and research when you're doing an investigative report?
Every investigation is different, but I do have a system for organizing stuff. I have all the interviews. Yeah, so when I do my interviews, I come back and I transcribe the interviews while it's fresh in my mind. Because the worst thing you can do is wait like 2-3 days. And if you're like me, I can't even read my handwriting after 2 or 3 days, and I have no idea what's there. So I come back and I transcribe the interviews. And as I'm doing that, I'm writing chunks of the story. Now it may change, but I'm writing chunks, and I'm also pulling out the best quotes. So and I do all of this in a Google Doc, right? Because, particularly if it's not a super sensitive thing, put it all in a Google Doc, so that when I'm traveling, I can get access to it, or I can put it in the cloud and something else like Dropbox or something like that. But so I take all my research information and I organize it by topic. So if I'm writing about like gun smuggling or something, I have one folder, and I say folder, I mean like, on my computer, I have one folder about laws, right? I have one folder that deals with gun calibers. I have one folder that deals with like smuggling. I have another folder that deals with all the law enforcement agencies that oversee, the export of guns. So everything is organized by topic, and I don't stick everything in the same folder. Now I may have subfolders, but I try to keep all that information separated, and all the like material goes together. And the other thing is I organize my material by the way that is going to go into the story. So that when I start writing, the information is already organized in a way that I don't have to stop, find this folder, read it, and then go on. So everything is already laid out and organized. And again, the outline might change, but that's how I start off. And I may shuffle some stuff around, but that's essentially my process for getting and processing and organizing materials.
Right. I want to welcome the international reporters who are joining us. We've got a couple of people who have questions that refer to international reporting.
Sure.
This one is a freelance journalist in East Africa who wants to start reporting on extremism and violence in Eastern and Southern Africa. What would it take to report for the AP?
What would it report to? So this is my first day here, so
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
kind of like,
I'm reading these
you
things
know,
coming,
I
guys.
am. I will tell you what. Give me a couple of weeks, and then I can answer that on what would it take to report for the AP. So yes, I'm an editor. Yes, I oversee these people, but it's my first day. So
Give
I
them
really
some
got,
time.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
give them
I'm
some
still
time.
trying to figure out where
All
the
right.
bathrooms are. So
Let's let's go on to the next one.
Right. Okay.
Do international organizations like the WTO have similar processes like FOIA to request information?
A lot of governmental organizations like that do have some type of process. I haven't done a lot with WTO, but I know like the UN does, that they have a process where they will provide information to you. It's I can't think of it off the top of my head, but yes, a lot of these big international NGOs actually do have a similar law or regulation that allows them to give information to you in the same way that a governmental body would.
To our members, keep your questions coming. I'm going through a few of them, so please don't hesitate. All right, so here's another one. Have you ever landed a story from filing a FOIA for other FOIAs?
From filing FOIAs for other FOIAs?
Right. Have you ever landed a story from filing FOIAs for another FOIA?
Yes, it's something I do all the time, and I tell people to do that.
I think what they're trying to say okay.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, so the thing about FOIA is that the people who use it the least are journalists. So when I file a FOIA for other FOIAs, I'm trying to find out like what lobbyists are asking for, or what lawmakers are asking for, or what universities or other researchers are asking for. I'm not trying to spy on my competitors, like the Post, or my former paper, the New York Times. While those FOIAs are publicly, once you file a FOIA, it's a public document. But what I'm trying to find out is what other people are asking for, particularly folks like lobbyists or big NGOs, folks like that. And yes, I have gotten stories out of that.
All right. Do you ever use Ancestry.com in your reporting?
I have not. I have Ancestry.com, but it's been more about like just personal stuff. I do know people who use it. Margot Williams, who's at the Intercept, used to be at the New York Times and at the Washington Post. I know she uses it a lot. There's been some people who've done stuff like on, looking at the President Trump's ancestors and where they came from and what they have. Stephen Miller, his anti-immigration advisor. That's not his title, but I know that people have looked at like his ancestors who have come here and couldn't read or couldn't speak English. So I know that it has been used that way. I personally have not used it that way, but it is a great tool because it has all of this information about people going back, decades.
Lots of applause for this session. So here's another question. On the nuts and bolts side, are your stories lawyered prior to publication? And do you do a line by line?
So not all of them. It depends on the story.
Really?
Yeah, my very last story that I did for the New York Times was heavily lawyered because it involved, basically saying a gun manufacturer may have known about that their weapons were being used to kill endangered rhinoceros. So that was heavily lawyered. The attorney went through and gladly for me pointed out stuff that may have gotten into trouble. Again, it depends on the story. Now, line by line editing is something that I learned at the Minneapolis Star Tribune, that actually, as I'm an editor now, that's something that I have done there. It is basically like going to the dentist, but at the end of the process, you feel much better, just like you do at the end of the process when you go to the dentist. With line by line editing, you go through every single fact line by line, and if the person cannot, I don't care if everybody knows that the police chief is named this or that, you need to have some documentation that says the police chief is a business card, something. Otherwise, it gets cut from the story. That's
Oh,
the way that I've done line by line editing. You need to prove every single fact that is in the story line by line.
well, this next question is a great follow-up to that. The question is it really hard to get sources to come forward to verify your stories, to verify the reporting?
No, no, because the thing is, that's how a lot of my stories start, with those sources. But I want to have more than just one or two people saying it. You know, I know a lot of people say, well, if I got two sources saying, well, two sources can be not telling the truth too. So I try to get as much stuff as I can to verify every single fact that's in the story, preferably written stuff. Every source that tells me something, I want to know how you know. Like, if you were there, what color were the curtains? What time was it? You know, what was the weather like outside? Was it raining? Was it sunny? You know, who else was in the room? You know, all of those different things help me to better understand that you know what you're talking about. Because every time someone tells me something is a source, I want to know, how do you know that?
All right. We have obviously both print and broadcast
Sure.
reporters who are joining the webinar. This is a little bit more from the broadcasting side,
Sure.
because as a broadcaster, we feel like it's very difficult for, especially, you know, when you talk about investigative story, for people to actually want to show their face.
Right.
So how do you do it? You know,
Well, you guys have that really cool thing as broadcasters where you can like black out a person's face, and I always wish it's print. Like, why can't we do that?
you're right.
But
We can
but
blur your
yeah, you
face,
guys
and we
have
can
that
also
really
make you
cool.
sound like Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck. You
Exactly.
know, if you
Right.
and then we just font under what you're saying. We do have that, but
Right.
we always, though, on the other side, we're very envious when you
Right.
guys seem to be able to get those great quotes.
Right.
And people will talk to the print reporters,
Right.
we think, before they will sometimes talk to the television reporters. But the bottom line is, you clearly are able to, with your experience, get people to reveal themselves, get people
Right.
to say things, get people to give you the quote.
Right.
What are the tricks that you use, or how are you able to do this?
Well, the thing
What do you
is,
say?
right, going back to what I was talking about before, building relationships with people. I know that's not always possible, because the reason that I got into investigative reporting, believe it or not, was because of Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes is broadcast, right? But they get people to talk. Front line, they get people to talk. You know, when Brian Ross is on, he got people to talk. So it is possible to do it, but it's all about building relationships with people so they become comfortable with telling you this information. Again, you cannot just show up when you need something to call on people. It's just like, you know, your cousin Pookie or Ray Ray, who just show up when they need $20 or something, right? You want to develop relationships with people, and you want to keep those relationships. There are people, like when I was in Roanoke, who are still sources. And I went to Roanoke in 1997. So I still have people who are sources, who were sources for me then. Because as you move up, those same people move up. They move into different positions. They move into leadership positions as well. You also have to look at the people that are around you, and understand that you may have sources at the barbershop, at the beauty salon, at the supermarket. People that, if you stop and talk to them, you never know where they work or what information they may have. So it's all about building relationships with people. because some of the best things that I've gotten have just been from just talking to people at my barbershop. And you can see it takes a lot to do my hair. So, you know, as I'm waiting to have all of this done, you're just talking to people. And a lot of the guys in there are, you know, because I live in Washington here, a lot of those guys are congressional staffers. There's a, you know, a guy who works at the White House. There are people who work elsewhere. And you also have to look at your own background. Like I was in the U.S. Marine Corps. A lot of those same people who I was in the Marine Corps with are now in law enforcement. They're senior, you know, leaders in law enforcement now. We stay in touch. But it's basically doing an audit of yourself to figure out who do you know, because you may know more people than you think you know, right? And even if you're a young reporter, you still may know a lot more people than you actually think that you know, and you can utilize that.
But here's a follow-up question for that one then.
Sure.
Do you have a system for juggling the sources, the calls, the meetings, to stay in touch with all of these people?
I just, you know, I try and reach out to people like every week, different people, right? I will say, I will, you know, call up if, you know, somebody gets a new puppy or something. You know, sadly, a good source of mine is who works for a law enforcement agency is dying of cancer. I've just stayed in touch with them, you know, sent him a card, you know, talk to his family. You know, again, he's not necessarily a friend, but just being human and just taking the time to like send people a note. Like, hey, don't want anything, but how's it going? You know, send them an email saying, hey, you know, hey, your kid just went to college, right? You know, how's that going? Just being basic human, but it's at the same time, keeping those barriers there, because we're not friends. We're not going to be hanging out. You know, we're not going to be going to the game together. So it's just taking, so I work 5 days. Well, I get paid for working, you know, 5 days. I actually work 7. But each week I have a list of people that I need to send an email to, or I need to just pick up a phone and call or send a text to, or just say, hey, you know what, let's meet for lunch or let's meet for drinks. I mean, I don't drink, but you have whatever you're having. I have my Diet Coke, and, you know, we can chat while we're doing that.
Okay. We've got a few more.
Sure.
Before you pitch your editor in a story,
Mm-hmm.
what is your checklist to make sure it's an investigative piece and not an enterprise piece or an explainer piece?
Okay. So this especially comes into play now since I'm an editor, because, you know, it takes a lot for me to approve things, right? So the thing is, what I want to see from a reporter, right, is, first of all, what's new about this? Like, tell me what's new about this. And secondly, why should people care? You know, why do the public care about this? Who was harmed? Who harmed people? You know, how long has this been going on, right? Can we prove it? How can we prove it? If you can give me sort of go through my checklist and check off most of those things, right, I will let you go forward with it. But you need to have done enough reporting to let me know that there is a germ of a story there. And then once we get past that checklist, I want to know, what's your minimum story? I know you want to do this big thing and do a Watergate and bring down the president. Okay, that's laudable. But what happens if you can't do that? What can you give me? If you have, you know, that, and I see that you have thought that out and have done some work, then I'll approve it. But it's got to meet that criteria. Otherwise, you know, I heard people say, hey, I put 2 weeks into 3 weeks into this. Don't care. If you can't meet that standard, then I don't care how much time you put into it. Don't care.
I'm going to ask another question. One of the members, one of you guys out there, you're asking me to repeat some of the questions. I'm not quite sure what you're asking me. I'm asking the questions and Ron is answering them. But if you just send me another text and I will try to respond to you. So our next question here is, okay, what do you do when you have a state with open records laws that don't define a specific response time? They seemingly milk the reasonable response time. It sounds like this person's saying, so yeah, and that's a question I have too, when they read every excuse in the world not to respond to my FOIA, then now what? Now what do I do?
Right. So a couple of things that you can do there. The first thing is I just start calling them like every day after, you know, what I think is like a reasonable amount of time. Let's say I'm only asking for a report. I know you got it. I know it's 30 pages. Okay. You know, after a couple of days, after you've got time to get my request, you open the email or you open the letter, 3 days for me, that's reasonable. You should be able to give me that information. So if you don't, I start calling you and I log every call that I have. And I will also email you, but in the subject line, I will put request for information #1. Second time, request for information #2. And I keep going in the subject line until it's up to a point where they're like, okay, you know what? I need to get rid of this dude because it's just like, you know, it's basically shaming. The other thing that you can do is bypass them. And what I mean by that is when I was in South Carolina, I tried to get some crime stats, but the local police actually, you know, they dragged their feet and they didn't want to give us the crime stats. But for things like that, you have to remember that everybody reports to somebody else. The big report that comes out every year is the FBI Uniform Crime Reports. How do they get that information? That information starts at the local level, then it gets passed up to somebody else, and then it gets passed up to somebody else. If I can't get the information at one spot, I'll get it from someplace else. When I was in Minnesota, we tried to get some information from tribal governments. They said, we're sovereign governments. We don't have to give you anything. But those same tribal governments get money from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I FOIA'd the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I basically just backdoored them. And you can do that, right? If you can't get the information one way, think about all the other ways that entity interacts with other agencies and try to get the information from them. But don't stop bothering them. Call them, send them that, and in the subject line, again, request #1, request #2, request #3, and I guarantee you that somebody will respond.
Okay. So this is probably going to be one of our last questions because I'm going to combine some things. I get the response. What our members really want you to know, go over it again. How do you decide when to run with a story? How do you decide that this is a good investigative piece? What are the questions that you ask yourself to say, you know, this is the kind of investigation that we should do? You've answered this question a couple of times, but we want to hear the list again so we can write it all down.
Okay. So the first thing is what's new about this, right? If you're telling me you're writing something about casinos, okay, that's fine. But what's new about this, right? I don't want to rehash what other people have done. If you can tell me a new angle, then fine. Secondly, why should I care? Like, if I write this, what's the public service, right? So what? If I'm reading this and I am my mom who lives in Alabama, if she's sitting there reading this, why should she care about this? Because I want her to read this. When she looks at it, and not just because a little boy's name is on it, but why should I care? Why should I continue to read this? Why should I spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, to read this? Thirdly, who is harmed by this? Like, who are the victims here? Is it the people who their water is contaminated? Is it the people who the kids are being exposed to lead? Is it the kids who go to school where the teachers aren't showing up, or the teachers who are having to buy supplies because the school doesn't have the money? But who's being harmed by this? Then who is doing that harm, right? Can you show me the person that's actually doing the harm? But is that harm, is it systemic? In other words, is it a problem that involves the system, or is it episodic and it's more of an individual type of thing that is one person? In other words, is it a bad apple, or is the whole barrel rotten? So, again, and then thirdly, can we tell us, not thirdly, I'm sorry, I've gone through a whole lot of these. Yeah, see, brother can't even count. I'm like, bruh man from Martin, like the fifth floor. So I think the thing is that how can we tell the story in the most compelling way? I didn't say that before, but what is the most compelling way that we can tell the story? Because I see so many stories that they have really good information. It's like really good information. You can tell the reporter did a lot of work, and then they just dump their notebook.
Yeah. Listen, my apologies to you. As you know, Ron, tonight we had 2 webinars, and the next one starts in about 3 minutes.
Okay.
So give a little bit time for transition. I want to thank all the people, all of our members who joined us tonight. And Ron, we're just going to have you back for Investigative Reporting 102.
Sure.
Okay. There's a lot of great information and a lot of thank you comings. Contact. They want to know. Give us your contact information. Where are you now?
Okay, so I am at the Associated Press, and I just actually got my email, which is rnixon@ap.org. You can also contact me at nixon.ron@gmail.com. That's
Okay.
my personal email. So happy to, and on Twitter @NixonRon, just my name backwards. So hit me up on either of those things, and be more than happy to chat. My DMs are open on Twitter, so you can hit me up that way too.
All right. I'm going to have to let you run. Thank you. Thank you, NABJ members. Thank you, Ron Nixon.
Thank you, guys. Thank you,
Have a good
NABJ.
evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.